Good afternoon on our webinar. I would like to very warmly welcome the audience and our international guest. The subject of the webinar is Impact Ranking of Times Higher Education 2021. First, let me introduce our international guests representing the Times Higher Education, Mr. Duncan Ross, Chief Data Officer in Times Higher Education, helping to create new and innovative rankings and data products across the higher education sector. He was listed on the top 50 data leaders in the UK by Information Age and as one of the Data's IQ Big Data 100. Prior to joining Times Higher Education, he was Director Data Science and Teradata with a remit across all industries and the entire international region. Duncan regularly speaks at business conferences and has several published papers on aspects of data mining for business. He was part of the team that founded the Society of Data Miners and is strongly involved with the data philanthropy movement, being one of the founder directors of Data Kind UK. Welcome here, Duncan.
Thank you very much.
I would like to also introduce Michael Lubacz. Michael is a business development director in Times Higher Education. Michael provides innovative and leading in his class resolution for Times Higher Education concerning the data, but also building the brand awareness, recruitment and enrollment strategies for the universities and the non-governmental institutions all over the world. Prior, he was the director responsible for Asia and Pacific region and cooperated with hundreds of the universities, different profiles, supporting internationalizations and strategy, and especially ranking strategy. Michael is working with us in Poland, and hopefully it's also Polish heritage here has its meaning. Welcome here, Michael. Okay, so we would like to begin our seminar about the Times Higher Education rankings. We would like to discuss during the seminar the opportunities of the rankings in general, but especially impact ranking, that is the specific one concerning the development of the sustainable development, that is crucial issues for universities all over the world, not only here in Poland. And for the beginning, let me introduce PCG Polska. Public Consulting Group is the corporation Boston-based, but it's operating also in Poland. And here we have the in group the companies PCG Academia. This is profile of higher education. Librus, this is high schools. More than 4,000 high school is working with Librus in this moment, more than 50 universities with PCG Academia, and also a PCG Education. We have over 250 consultants in the offices in Warsaw, Łódź, Rzeszów, and Katowice. And about our today's subject, I would like to say a few words about the opportunities that we are creating by this cooperation of PCG and Times Higher Education. We would like to support the ranking strategy, internationalization process for the leading universities here in Poland. And our first joint activity is the analysis of Times Higher Education impact rankings, and this is our today's meeting. And we are also organizing together Lumen Conference, which is the 7th Lumen Conference. We are organizing the conference 23rd and 24th of November. So we would like to very warmly invite all of the participants of our webinar to the conference in November. And maybe a very brief introduction about the world of the rankings. We can say that rankings are not admired by the majority of the academic professionals, but they are treated like the obligatory part of the assessment and accountability of the university. We are just ranked, we are assessed. This is not only a question of the academic ethos of doing the good work in the scientific and educational activities or that mission, but this is also the necessity of being ranked in the perspective of the global competition. We are entering into a kind of the international game. Poland, by its last reforms, especially this one done in 2018 called Law 2.0, is entering more and more into this field of the global competition, and the importance of the international rankings is actually crucial. The question is, what type of the rankings? As we perfectly know, there is a very small group of the leading organizations that are doing such international rankings. This is Times Higher Education, but this is also Shanghai ranking, for example. And if we try to find a methodology of the ranking which is adjust for the Polish market, I will say balanced one. We should look for the position in all of the important rankings. That's obvious for me from the perspective of Polish higher education institutions, but we should especially be concentrated on the rankings where the criteria of science are balanced together with the criteria of the education and that mission. And this is the development of a Shanghai list that is concentrated mainly on scientific achievements. The stratification, the position in the ranking depends on the scientific position. So the number of the universities ranked in the first 500s or even 1,000 from Poland, it's, let's say, limited to 10, let's say, in future maybe to 20. And that's important from scientific assessment. But if we would like to look at the crucial educational mission of the Polish universities, educational criteria are fundamental. So Times Higher Education offers a perspective of assessment in a more balanced way, taking into account scientific achievement, but also education and that mission. And it can be done in a type of the disciplinary rankings and also impact rankings. And the type of these impact rankings that is taking strongly into account the sustainability of the organization and the impact of the science education, but also that mission, will be presented here during this session. And I think it can be a very interesting area for the Polish universities. I would like to mention that in this moment, we have more than 10 Polish institutions ranked in the impact rankings, and the interest is growing. So this seminar is also the goal of the dissemination of the knowledge about Times Higher Education and impact rankings to many Polish higher education institutions. The agenda of this session is the presentation of our international guests, and then there will be possibility to ask the questions here. The questions can be asked, of course, in English, but also in Polish, if there is such a need. So I would like to give the voice firstly to Michael Lubacz and then to Duncan Ross. Please, Michael, the floor is yours. Now, Duncan, could you tell a few words? Maybe from this side that will be okay.
Of course. So, Michael, whilst we wait for you to be able to rejoin with microphone. Can I thank everyone who's attending the call today for their participation? We're very excited about the opportunity to work together with PCG and to reach out to universities across Poland. In my session, I'm going to be exploring how the impact ranking has been built out, looking at its methodology, and trying to understand or trying to showcase some of the decisions we've made to try and make this as fair as is possible. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Times Higher Education has been in existence for 50 years. 2021 is our 50th anniversary. And throughout that period, we've really been trying to help universities to understand their position against their mission. And it's worth remembering, of course, as we heard a few moments ago, that universities have multiple missions. We can't look at universities purely from a very narrow perspective. We need to understand their broader role in society. Obviously, we also want to help students find and access the university best suited to their abilities and their aspirations. And above all, to help higher education deliver transformational teaching, research, and innovation. Now, later on, when we get Michael back, he will talk about some of the broader aspects of the work that we do. But I'm going to focus today on how we use data to support this understanding of universities. Now, obviously, governments collect data on universities, but it can still be very challenging to understand how to compare universities in one country with universities in another country. So how would we compare the Polish universities against universities in Germany or universities in Russia or universities in the United States of America? And of course, at Times Higher Education, one of the mechanisms we use to gather that data are the university rankings. Yes, it's worth remembering that they do generate these lists, that they generate visibility, and they generate assessments, but they also enable us to gather data for understanding. And at Times Higher Education, we have 3 sets of rankings. The oldest are the World University Rankings. These were first created in 2004 and very much focus on the research mission of universities. The second set of rankings we produce are the teaching rankings. Now, teaching is much more difficult to assess internationally, and at the moment we have teaching rankings in the United States of America, published in the Wall Street Journal, and in Japan. And finally, and most recently in 2019, we launched our third set of rankings, looking at the impact that universities have on society. So each of these 3 sets of rankings, these 3 perspectives or 3 missions, can be picked on as being the leading reason why universities exist. And there is a strong case to be made for each. So if we move to the next slide, let's look at the case for research. Next slide, please. So the case for the research mission, and this is very much the mission that we heard about from earlier on, the mission that Shanghai look at in their ranking, is usually the traditional view of what makes a global leading university on the world stage. Most so-called leading universities clearly have a research focus. If I went out onto the streets of Warsaw or of Krakow, or indeed of London, and asked a passerby what are the best universities in the world, the list I got back would be remarkably similar and would be focused on these research-intensive universities. And we also need to recognize that research is often the route that we take into leadership and leading universities. So you start off, you get your PhD, you become a professor, you lead your department, your faculty, and eventually you end up running a university. But there's also a very strong case for teaching. Next slide, please. And this is the case that our governments often focus on. They focus on this idea of universities as being a mechanism for taking people from school, taking children and turning them into useful and productive employees. Now, often this is far too much of a focus from governments, but we have to recognise that, of course, teaching is one of the major ways that universities are funded, either through direct fees from students in countries like the United Kingdom, but also in funding direct from governments to reflect student numbers. It's also worth remembering that, of course, without teaching, we have no researchers, that teaching informs the next generation of research expertise. But I'm going to make the case for the third mission, for looking at the direct impact that universities have in the world, and specifically looking at that from the perspective of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Both why those goals are important to universities, but also why universities are critically important if society is to achieve those goals. Next slide. So the case for sustainability is straightforward. The world is in a crisis at the moment, not just the COVID-19 crisis, but also an environmental crisis. And in 2015, the United Nations created the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that look at sustainability from a very broad perspective. Yes, they look at the traditional green agenda, ensuring that we can take action to save our climate and save our planet, but they also recognise that this must be done in a way that is equitable and fair across the world, that we can't have a situation where we leave people or societies behind. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are associated with 169 indicators and 223 unique targets. And universities are critically important if we are to achieve those goals, because the higher education sector is worth almost 2% of the global economy. It's a huge part of society. And also, uniquely for any industry, universities are located wherever there are people, not just in our capital cities, but across our countries. There are 25,000 universities in the world, and they all have a critical role to play in delivering on the sustainability agenda. So if we agree that sustainability is important for universities, how can we go about assessing it? Next slide. And assessing impact in terms of sustainability is not a straightforward undertaking. The Sustainable Development Goals, and 193 of our governments have signed up to those, are not designed with universities in mind. In fact, universities are only mentioned once in all of the documentation. So at Times Higher Education, we've had to work to develop our own theory of change, which helps us to understand how universities can directly address the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, a theory of change is simply a framework for understanding how any organization can go from inputs from the resources you have available to you, through to outputs, the work that you do, and eventually to outcomes, how those actions can have a differential impact in society. Next slide. So what is our theory of change? Well, it actually has 4 distinct elements. The first of those is around the research that your university does. So this links back to the research agenda that we talked about earlier on. But it's clear that research that you do can have a distinct impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. Looking, for example, here at SDG 2, Zero Hunger. The research that your university does into farming practices, into sustainable agriculture, will have a direct impact in how we can deliver zero hunger across the world. The second aspect is what we call stewardship. Universities are responsible for their own campuses, for their lands, but also they're responsible for the people associated with the university, whether those are your faculty, your broader employees, people from outside your university who work with your university, and of course, your students. And how you look after these resources with which you've been entrusted has a significant impact on how you deliver sustainability. Here in SDG 2, we look at how your university is working to ensure that no student has to abandon their studies because of their own or their family's hunger. The third aspect of our theory of change is something we call outreach, the work that your university does directly in the community. Universities have always worked within their communities. They've always done this outreach work, but all too often it isn't recognized and it isn't given the visibility that it deserves. Here within SDG 2, we look at the work that your university is doing directly in the community, but we also look at the work you're doing with your governments, both local city governments, regional governments, and national government, to ensure that they are developing good policy to address issues of national hunger. And then finally, we look at teaching. And we can look at teaching in two ways. As we do here, where we're looking for how your university is providing people with specific skills to address particular SDGs. So in this case, looking in SDG 2.0 hunger, we look at the proportion of your graduates who have a degree in agriculture or aquaculture with sustainability as part of the curriculum. So that addresses a very explicit need for certain skills. But in other SDGs, we look more generally at the work your university is doing to ensure that every graduate who leaves your institution takes with them an understanding of sustainability that they will take with them into whatever role they may have in the future. And what we've done is we've gone through every single SDG and created a set of metrics that relate to these four aspects of sustainability: research, stewardship, outreach, and teaching. Next slide, please. What this means is that whereas the United Nations have created their 17 SDGs with 169 indicators and 223 targets, we've matched those 17 SDGs with 17 individual rankings. Within those rankings, we have 105 different broad measures, and beneath those 220 discrete measurements we ask universities to take. And we then spent time going through each of those measurements to make sure that as far as possible they link back directly to the targets of the United Nations. For example, when we look at SDG 12, one of the things the United Nations has as a target is to increase the number of organizations that produce a sustainability report. And so in our SDG 12 ranking, that's one of the questions we ask. Does your university produce a sustainability report? In other instances, the link is less direct, but we've still made sure that the measurements we're asking for can be associated directly with the targets that the United Nations has created for us. Now, you might reasonably be asking an important question here. How has Times Higher Education tried to ensure that the metrics that we look at are as fair as is possible? And we recognize that we won't always have got this right, by the way. No ranking is perfect, and this is no exception there. But when we look at the next slide, we'll look at some of the things we've tried to do to ensure that the approach we've taken is as fair as possible. Next slide, please. So how can we be fair to universities across the world? Bearing in mind that the context that universities work with in Poland is very different than the context that universities work with in Peru or in Africa. Well, our first concern is one that came from the previous slide. You saw that we're looking to look at potentially 220 different measurements. And that suggests that universities will have to do an extensive amount of work in order to pull together the data needed to participate. And that could potentially create a significant barrier. So what we did is we made a concrete decision early on in the process that to be in the overall impact ranking, we would require universities to provide data for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goal, and any 3 other SDGs. As I said before, the main reason for doing that was to allow universities from parts of the world where there are fewer resources to participate in this ranking. But we also hoped that it would enable us to have a situation where universities would be able to focus on the SDGs which were most important to them in their particular context. A university on a coast, for example, might be more interested in SDG 14, life underwater, and a university that is inland might be more interested in SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. We also tried to think very carefully about the questions we were asking, making sure that they were precise enough to directly answer the focus of the SDG, but they were also asked in a way that was broad enough that universities in very different situations would be able to demonstrate the work they were doing. One aspect of this is that sometimes we have chosen metrics which are designed to reflect the need of a country rather than necessary to be truly fair to all universities. This enables us to counterweight the resources that some universities have. So universities from the United States, and sorry PCG, I'm going to pick on Boston in the United States here. Universities in Boston tend to have far more resources and be in a much more affluent city than universities, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we need to ensure that the metrics we're choosing actually take account for that and balance for that imbalance in resources. Of course, we've also tried to listen very carefully to input from universities, from organizations, and from individuals. I'm a white, tall Englishman. I bring to this ranking my own views, my own privileges. And so listening to other people from other parts of the world is critically important. And later on, I'll talk briefly about our advisory board that we've created to support the ongoing development of this ranking. Next slide. So if we're going to measure these things, how do we go about measuring specific aspects? The first thing I'd like to talk about is how we evaluate the research that universities are doing around the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, unlike the World University Rankings, where we look at very specific traditional research subject areas, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to recognize that much of the research is multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. And so we've worked with our bibliometric suppliers, Elsevier, to create a basket of keywords which enables us to identify specific publications for each and every Sustainable Development Goal. Once we have that basket of publications, we can, of course, apply a set of measurements on top of the publications. So, for example, the number of publications your university generates in SDG 3, or the number of times that those are used within clinical citation. But there's another important way in which this ranking is very different from most other rankings. Next slide, please. And that is that when we look at, particularly at outreach work that you're doing, we ask universities to provide evidence of the work that they're doing in the field. Here, for example, when we look at SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, we have a set of metrics where we ask you about the work that your university does around water within the community. And one of the questions we ask in more detail is how you're working with governments, whether those are local government, national government, or indeed international government bodies, to address issues of water security. Now, what are we looking for from universities? Well, we're looking for concrete examples of what the university is doing. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see an example from a university in China. And here we can see this Chinese university providing a piece of evidence that describes how their center of research into water is working with government to address these issues, these crucial issues of water security. Some things you'll notice about this. Firstly, of course, this is written in Chinese. We don't expect evidence to be provided in English. In fact, it would be rather bizarre if it was. If you're working with your local community, we would expect universities from Poland to be writing their material in Polish. And so when we assess this material, we make sure that we have people who are fluent in all relevant languages so we can understand and interpret the evidence that's provided. But it does mean that we need to have a mechanism for making decisions around the evidence. Does this evidence answer the questions that we've asked? We've tried to do this in a way that is a consistent framework so that we can be fair to universities who've submitted evidence and so that we can have a very consistent and coherent evaluation process. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you how we do that. And we're going to keep on thinking about this question from SDG 6, which looks at water in the community. So how would we assess the evidence that's provided? We do so using a simple point scoring approach. We don't do a full in-depth evaluation of the evidence, so we don't mark it as you might mark an essay. Firstly, we look at whether the university says it undertakes the activity, and we will always give credit when a university says, yes, we do this. But then our evaluator looks at the evidence. And if they think the evidence is a close match to the question, if it's a good answer, they will give a full mark. If they think it doesn't quite answer the question, but it's in the right general area, they will give half a mark. And obviously, if they don't think it answers the question at all, they will give no marks. Finally, though, we give additional points when the evidence is public. Now, why do we think that public evidence is important? There are three reasons. The first reason, which is undoubtedly the least important reason, is that it gives us at Times Higher Education greater confidence that your university is genuinely undertaking the work. The other two reasons are much more important, though. Firstly, by making your evidence public, you are holding yourself accountable to the general public for your actions. For example, if you say that your library is open to members of the public, and they turn up at your library and it isn't open, you will very quickly find out what they think of you. And of course, the third reason is also really important, and that is that we hope that universities will want to share the best practice that they're doing. If you're doing particularly brilliant work, we hope you'll want to share that, and we hope that other universities will come and will learn from your experience and hopefully go on to even greater heights in terms of the work they're doing around sustainability. So that's the process we've put in place. And this year we have had over 100,000 pieces of evidence submitted. So you can see it's a significant effort on our part to evaluate that evidence. One of the things we will be doing this year is creating a series of workshops where we will step your universities through the process that our assessors go through in terms of evaluating the evidence, hopefully to give you better guidance on how to identify the evidence that best showcases the work that your university is doing. And we'll announce dates for those workshops in the near future. Next slide, please. So how can we go from these individual rankings for each SDG to an overall ranking? Well, as I said a little while ago, we do this by taking the score around SDG 17 and the 3 SDGs that your university scores most strongly in. Those aren't necessarily the SDGs in which you rank most highly. You can sometimes score higher in a university where you rank slightly lower. But we pick those for you from all of the SDGs for which you submitted data. SDG 17, because it's compulsory, is worth 22% of the overall score, and each of the other SDGs is worth 26% of the score. Now, an interesting question here is always about how can universities determine which SDGs they ought to submit to. And sometimes this is because your university has a particular focus that you know you do well in a particular area. But sometimes you may also want to submit data for more than the minimum number. And later on, we'll see whether or not universities do that. Another relevant question, of course, is why have we chosen SDG 17 as the linchpin, as the SDG that is always counted? And we've done this because SDG 17 allows us, is designed really to reflect partnerships and working in cooperation across all the other SDGs. So we think it's actually a really good fit for the one SDG we'd like to see all universities participate in. But we have cheated slightly. We've taken one aspect around education for sustainable development and moved that from SDG 4, where it should actually sit, and move that into our evaluation of SDG 17. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that's worth pointing out is some of the changes we've made in the ranking between 2020 and 2021, and also mention some of the changes that we expect to happen for next year's methodology. Next slide. It's always worth saying that the quality of evidence that universities provide for this ranking is exceptionally strong. But we did notice in 2020 that some universities were finding it difficult to provide consistent and clear data for some questions, particularly when we looked at measurement of waste. And so for 2021, we changed these questions to be two-part questions. The first part is simply asking, do you measure this? And the second part then looks at the volumes or the amounts of waste generated. We also extended questions around SDG 13, carbon neutrality, looking to explore the scope of carbon neutrality that your university is associated with. And in SDG 17, again, we made a slight change to the question there, and we looked at how your university is reporting progress against the SDGs in a much more explicit way than we did in 2020. Next slide. We've also significantly enhanced the amount of documentation around our methodology. We now have over 150 pages of detailed guidance, and as I said just a few moments ago, we'll be expanding that by producing additional workshops to try and support universities in submitting data. We expanded the number of universities who are able to participate. In 2021, for the first time, we've admitted postgraduate only institutions. But we've also had to be a little bit more rigorous around our evaluation process. And this has been driven by the increasing number of universities who are participating. That's meant we've had to limit the freedom that our assessors have to search for additional supporting evidence. And we've looked purely at the evidence that universities have supplied. In terms of next year's rankings, we do already know about a few changes. One of those is fairly obviously that we are going to be more flexible about the years of evidence that we will accept, because many universities have had to limit their activities due to COVID-19. And so we will highlight this in next year's methodology document, which we will be releasing this September. Next slide. So for the next section, I just want to explore very briefly why some universities have chosen to participate in the rankings. And rather than using purely my own words, I want to use the voices of some university leaders. Now, the first reason that universities often choose to participate is around visibility. And if we look at the next slide, we will see what Santa Ono, the leader, the president of the University of British Columbia, has to say on this issue. His perspective is that it's important that universities have a mechanism for showcasing the work that they're doing in order to inspire actions that have positive impacts. And it's true that whatever disagreements people have about rankings, and we heard earlier on that we know that people don't always like rankings, they often see them as being a necessary evil. One of the things that we do appreciate about rankings is that they generate visibility for the work that your universities are doing. So that's often the first reason why universities might want to participate in the rankings. If we move to the next slide, we'll see the second reason. And these are the words of Dawn Freshwater, the Vice Chancellor for the University of Auckland, which was our #1 university for 2019 and 2020. And her perspective is that the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, and to a degree our rankings, support collaboration between academics across the international community. Now, this is a crucial aspect of sustainability. We know from bitter experience that the actions taken in one country have impacts across the world. And so we can't work within our own national borders. We have to work internationally in order to address sustainability. And then finally, if we move to the next slide, we see that it's also useful to use these rankings and the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework against which you can hold yourselves accountable. Because this is something that's increasingly important to our students, our staff, and our alumni. And if we get Michael back later on, Michael has some really interesting insights into how students and prospective students are viewing sustainability. But let's move on now and look at some of the data that has come out of the rankings. So if we can look to the next slide. And here we're going to look at not just results from Polish universities, the 12 universities from Poland who are already participating, but we'll also look more broadly on the world stage. Now, the first question that is posed by the ability for universities to submit data to more than one SDG, but not all 17, is, are all SDGs equally as popular? Now, if we look at the next slide, we'll see the answer to this. The answer is, of course, no. Universities in different contexts are providing insights into very different SDGs. Now, try and remember what this slide looks like, because if Michael comes back later on, we'll be able to see a very different chart looking at how students view the importance of different SDGs. But this is the university perspective. Now, we should slightly discount SDG 17. Remember, in our framework, that is the SDG which we require universities to provide data for. But here we can see there's a pattern. Some SDGs are more popular than others. The two most popular SDGs are SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 3, which is good health and well-being. Now, why is that the case? Well, fairly obviously, universities are in the education business, so it's perhaps no surprise that quality education is the number one SDG. Good health and well-being also makes a lot of sense. Universities, even those universities who don't have an exclusively medical focus, are often associated with the teaching of our nurses and our doctors and other health professionals. They often have university hospitals associated with them. So it's perhaps no surprise that SDGs 3 and 4 are seen as important for universities. But it's also interesting to notice that SDG 5, gender equality, is important, and indeed other SDGs around economic development. But it's also worth reflecting on those SDGs that are less popular. SDG 2, zero hunger, SDGs 14 and 15, life underwater and life on land, and to a degree SDGs 6 and 7. Now, why are they seen as less significant, or why do fewer universities choose to participate in those SDGs? It could genuinely be that the universities are less concerned with those SDGs, but it could also be that at Times Higher Education we're asking the wrong questions. So we need to reflect on that ourselves. Now, the other thing we can see from this chart is the growth in participation from 2020 to 2021. Because for each SDG, you can see there are two bars. The bar on the left is the number of universities from 2020, and the bar on the right is the number of universities from 2021. And we can see that every single SDG has seen a significant growth. In fact, the number of universities overall that is participating has grown to 1,240 universities globally. That's a 48% increase year on year. So let's move to the next slide. And here we can see the parts of the world where we are seeing that growth. The biggest single area and the biggest area of growth comes from universities from Asia, but we see that Europe is not far behind. Two areas where I would like to see further growth in future are, of course, from Africa and, interestingly, from North America. We're still seeing that many universities from the United States haven't yet decided to participate in this particular ranking, but I expect that to grow as time goes by. The reason that we have less growth from Australia and New Zealand is simply that most of their universities already participate, so there are limited opportunities for further growth. Next slide, please. I did say we'd explore how many SDGs individual universities have chosen to submit to. And this distribution shows us some data around that. Some universities choose to only participate in one or two SDGs, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great way for universities to explore whether or not they want to more fully commit, while still demonstrating a commitment to sustainability. It's also no surprise that we see a peak at 4 SDGs, and most of the time that's SDG 17 plus another 3 SDGs, and that then this tails off as we move up, as the workload required to submit data increases. But there is a really interesting feature on this chart, and that is the number of universities who have chosen to submit to all 17 SDGs. Why might a university do that? Because that is a lot of work and a lot of commitment. The first reason is a slightly self-centered one, but I don't think there's any harm in it. And that is that, of course, if you submit data to all 17 SDGs, it's possible that you outperform your expectations in particular SDGs. The other reason, though, is a stronger one, and that is that we're seeing an increasing number of universities who want to demonstrate their commitment to every single SDG, even in areas where they suspect or know they will perform less strongly. That willingness to demonstrate their commitment and their willingness to grow and develop is a very, very positive thing. 262 universities from across the world have chosen to submit to all 17 SDGs in 2021. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. Excellent. No, sorry, can you go back one? Thank you. So we looked at the distribution of all SDGs across universities across the world, but it's interesting to note that universities in different parts of the world have different focuses. They submit data to different SDGs. And here we're looking at just universities from Europe. And the baseline here is that overall distribution chart that I showed you before. If the bar here goes above the line, it suggests that universities in this region are more likely to submit to this particular SDG. If it goes below the line, they're less likely to. So what patterns do we see from European universities? Interestingly, European universities are far less likely to submit data around SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, and SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. Now, why is that the case? Well, I would argue that's because Europe is, on a global scale, a relatively wealthy part of the world. Poverty and hunger, although they still exist, are far less of a pressing concern within Europe than they are, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. I'd also argue, particularly coming from the United Kingdom, that water is less of a concern for us. We're in a very wet part of the world. It's far less of a concern for us in Europe than it is in some other parts of the world. On the other side, though, we see that universities from Europe are much more likely to submit data around SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and also SDG 13, climate action, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And 3 of those, SDG 8, decent work, economic growth, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, could almost be a blueprint for the European Union. And I should at this stage apologize for Brexit, I guess. So it seems as if universities, certainly from within Europe, are focusing on the issues that make most sense for them in their context. And I think that's a very positive sign for the ranking. But if we go on to the next slide, let's look at the scores from universities in Europe. And here I'm using box and whisker plots to explore these scores. And I'm not looking purely at Poland because only 12 Polish universities participated. When you have very small data sets, box and whisker plots can sometimes be misleading. So instead, I'm looking at overall performance from European universities. Now, with a box and whisker plot, the way you can best understand this is as being an exploration of the distribution of scores for each SDG. The line in the middle of the distribution is the median value. So if I lined all of the universities up from the lowest score to the highest score, that line in the middle represents the score of the university exactly in the middle. The box is the middle 50% of the distribution, and then the whiskers look at the strongest and weakest performing universities. Now, what we can see here is that there are some SDGs where European universities are clearly outperforming the world as a whole. These don't always match up to the SDGs where they are more likely to submit data, though. So, for example, when we look at SDG 3, we can see that median is above 60 points. So it's actually a very strong performance there from European universities in good health and well-being. We see the same as the case clearly in SDG 8. That bar, that median value, is much higher than the global average, which we'd expect to see at about 50. But we can also look at the tails of the distribution. So even in SDGs like SDG 6, where European universities are far less likely to submit data, we can see strong performances there. The very best universities in Europe are amongst the best in the world. But I'm actually going to dig a little bit deeper into 3 specific SDGs to highlight the performance of Polish universities. And just before that, we'll look at how Polish universities perform overall on the world stage. Next slide, please. So as has been said, 12 Polish universities participated in the rankings overall, and the top universities in Poland in equal first place, because they are within a university band, are the University of Warsaw, the Medical University of Warsaw, and Gdańsk University of Technology. The top ranked university in the world, by the way, this year was the University of Manchester from the United Kingdom. Now, obviously, there's a concern here. If the impact ranking was simply reflecting what we saw in the world university ranking, so we just see the same usual suspects coming to the top, then I think we wouldn't be achieving some of our goals about equity and equality. And when we compare the top 100 universities from the world university ranking in red and the impact ranking in blue, we see some signs that actually we're doing something a little bit different here. Particularly notable are the fact that 2 African universities are able to get into our global top 100 and 1 South American university. It's also interesting to note that of the 26 North American universities in the top 100 in the impact ranking, 2 of those universities come from Mexico rather than the United States or Canada. But if we go to the next slide, we can see where those Polish universities score. And you can see that the top ranked Polish universities, the 3 top ranked universities, come in the 601 to 800 band. Now, why don't Polish universities score more strongly? I think there is additional work that we can do at Times Higher Education to help your universities understand how to demonstrate the work that you're doing. I believe that there are further insights that we can see from the success of your universities around sustainability that at the moment we're not seeing. And we can tell that that's the case by exploring some of the individual SDGs in more detail. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the performance of universities, Polish universities, in SDG number 3, good health and well-being. And the top ranked Polish university in this SDG is in the 101 to the 200 category. So clearly scoring much more strongly here than they are in the overall ranking. And that, of course, is the Warsaw Medical University. Let's look at the 3 different areas we measure within good health and well-being and compare that with the number 1 university in the world, which is Oregon Health and Science University. Now, obviously, this is an SDG where universities that have a medical focus have a distinct advantage, both in terms of the research they produce, and you can see here that the research being produced by Warsaw Medical University is not dissimilar in terms of its score from the research being produced by the Oregon Health and Science University. And when we look at research in this SDG, we look at both the number of publications, but also the number of publications that are cited in clinical guidance. We also look at the proportion of graduates that are leaving the university with a degree in health sciences or a degree that will take them on the road to becoming a practicing medic. And we look at collaboration with health services and health work that the university does in the community. And this is perhaps an area where we can work with Polish universities to better explore how you can evidence the work you're doing. If we move to the next slide, we'll see how Polish universities are doing compared, and in this case I decided to compare Polish universities with universities in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We can see that Polish universities are actually holding up very strongly. Only 3 Polish universities submitted data in this area, but they are holding up very strongly compared to universities in neighboring countries. The top-ranked universities in the world came, we had equal first university from TU Delft, TU Munich, the University of Toronto, and I can't read that final one there. I'm trying to remember what it is, but we do see a lot of very close competition there at the very top of the ranking. So what things are we evaluating when we look at SDG number 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure? Well, again, as always, we look at the research your university is doing, but we also look at the number of patents that cite research done by your university. So not the number of patents your university owns, because that depends very much on the local legislation, but on how often patents more generally cite the research you're doing. And we can see here that the Gdańsk University of Technology, the #1 university from Poland, actually performs very strongly, both in terms of research and in terms of patent citations. The 2 other measures we look at, the final measure I look at first, that is the proportion of income that comes from industry and commerce, and that's looking at a very similar measure to one of the measures we use in the World University Rankings. And then the final measure is one where the Gdańsk University of Technology doesn't score as strongly, and that's looking at the number of university spin-offs that have been generated. But despite that, again, the university scores quite strongly and comes in the 101 to 200 category. So again, a strong performance compared to the overall performance in the in the impact rankings. And then the final SDG I'll look at on the next slide is SDG 17, which is of course the one that is the required SDG. And I'm looking at this not because Polish universities do especially strongly, but because this is the mandatory SDG. The top-ranked university in Poland here is the University of Warsaw, coming in the 301 to 400 category. And the top university in the world is the University of Newcastle from Australia. So what do we look at in this particular SDG? Again, we look at research. We look at the number of publications which are co-authored with universities in lower and low middle income countries. We also look at, and this is an area where I think many universities around the world can significantly improve their performance, we look at how you measure your evaluation and publish that measurement against each of the SDGs. And then finally, we look at your commitment to education for sustainability. Now, when we're looking at the publication for progress against the SDGs, we don't necessarily need a detailed report for each SDG, nor do we necessarily need a specific report that may be different from your overall sustainability report. But we do hope that you will clearly identify how you're working towards the SDGs, not necessarily in terms that we measure in the rankings, but more generally. Now, in the final few minutes before I'm going to hopefully hand back to Michael, let's look at how we're trying to ensure that we have inputs from universities across the world and what the timetable looks like for next year's ranking. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is our advisory board. We opened up invitations for people to put their name forward, and we had over 140 applications from across the world, and some absolutely fantastic people put their name forward. I hope to end up with a board of approximately 12 people, and we're still working on developing that board, but I'm pleased to announce on the next slide the first 4 members of our board. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And those people are Professor Max Liu, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. Professor Lu started his career, he was born in China, and he went on to took his PhD in Australia before moving to Hong Kong, where he led universities, and then moving to the United Kingdom. We're also delighted to have Dr. Jingwen Mu joining us, because although it's great to have vice chancellors on the board, it's also great to have people who actually do work. In the case of Dr. Mu, she is responsible for gathering the data that goes into the university rankings from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Megan Fay-Zarnissa is the Chief Executive Officer of the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education in the United States. They pull together their own assessment process, the STARS assessment process. And finally, at this stage, we're joined by Professor Yamaguchi, who is the Director for the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability in Japan. We will be growing the board, and we hope that this will give universities across the world a mechanism for more formally giving us guidance on when we get things right, and also importantly on when we get things wrong in terms of this ranking. And my final slide today is to talk about the participation in next year's rankings. We don't charge universities to be part of the rankings, it is free. However, there is of course a commitment of time and resource on your part. We will publish the 2022 methodology this September, and shortly after that we will open data collection. If you're interested in participating, or if you have any further questions, do please contact us on impact@timeshighereducation.com. That in no way commits you to being part of the rankings, but it will allow us to give you access to the detailed documentation and allow you to explore our data submission portal and get a better understanding of what it means to be part of this exciting initiative. With that, thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully we can go back to Michael to take us through what would have been the first part of the presentation. Michael.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I hope you can hear me now. Yes. Okay, fantastic. Very big apologies for that technical issue, but thank you very much for Duncan for taking over. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us this afternoon across Poland. I'd also very much like to thank Professor Sułkowski and the team at PCG Academia for organising this very useful session. I did also want to present some slides. I appreciate they are going to be slightly out of order, so please do imagine that these were at the start of the presentation and they may make more sense. If you jump onto the next slide, I just wanted to share some insight into THE's history. And you can see on the left, THE has been around since 1971, and we are actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we have a very rich heritage in supporting excellence in the higher education community for 5 decades. But where we started on the left as a publisher, being the Times Higher Education Supplement, we have since evolved into a much more diverse organization that supports universities with thought leadership events, editorial intelligence, branding, hiring solutions, and also obviously rankings. And all of these solutions are really backed by rich data that we collect from multiple sources. And we also make that data available to universities and governments and corporations for the purpose of strategy, reputation management, rankings management, benchmarking, and also internationalization. Next slide, please. And I might actually ask you to skip these 2 slides because I have seen that Duncan covered them in his presentation. But just to follow up on that, we do look very much at the 3 core missions of a university. We're looking at teaching, where we do have a variety of teaching rankings in certain regions around the world. We support universities in the research mission with our World University Rankings. And obviously, as Duncan has spoke about, the impact rankings, looking at that 3rd mission and looking at how universities support society, both locally and on the world stage. Next slide, please. And if you can skip one more. Thank you very much. Why rankings are important, I think Duncan in his presentation gave a lot of great examples, but we very often see that although rankings can be quite a polarizing topic amongst academics and university leaders, they are also a very useful benchmarking tool. And when I speak to universities a lot around the world, I often see that they, rather than looking at rankings tables and looking at competitors, university leaders are looking at them as potential collaborators, looking at universities that have a very similar mission, very similar strengths, and looking for universities around the world that they can potentially partner with on research programs or even student exchange programs as well. And we often see that university leaders do look at the rankings when making a decision about which universities they potentially want to work with. Next slide, please. We also find that institutional research teams and planning offices are using the rankings prominently in helping to inform strategy. Now, when we've created the rankings, we certainly do not want universities to create strategies around rankings advancement. Rather, we expect that universities would use the data from the rankings to help inform those strategies. And we also have, as I've mentioned before, the data available for the universities to inform their strategy and advancement. Next slide, please. We also see that policy analysts, including Dirk van Dam from the OECD, use the rankings data on more of a macro level to understand how different regions and countries around the world, how strong their higher education systems are, and also how this can inform policy and also potentially funding, and again, encourage collaboration amongst different nations. Next slide. And we also work very closely with governments who do also look at the rankings to help inform, again, their policy and their framework. For example, we have worked with the government in Russia on the 5100 project, which is soon to be superseded by a new initiative. But we saw that the 5100 project did a great job in really advancing the international outlook of institutions within Russia. And we played quite a core part in helping build that framework. We're also working with the Thai government on the topic of impact and sustainability, where we are doing an exercise with them in collecting data on how universities are representing and making their impact on society visible. So we do work with several governments around the world from the perspective of data benchmarking and rankings. Next slide, please. Duncan shared a lot of information about the impact rankings, which is certainly the focal point of today's session. But I just wanted to share some information about our World University Rankings as well, which take a more deeper look into the research and teaching environment of an institution. For the World University Rankings 2021 edition, which was released in September last year, we had almost 2,000 universities submit data, and over 1,500 were ranked from 93 countries and territories. There are a few stricter entry requirements for the World University Rankings. We do require that universities publish at least 1,000 papers over a 5-year window, which is why the pool of universities that can potentially participate will always be smaller than the impact rankings. And that was done intentionally. The impact rankings were always, the desire was also always to allow a broader spectrum of universities to participate and showcase their excellence. But the World University Rankings is very much looking at the prestigious research-led universities around the world. And in addition to some of the research data points that we collect, we also conduct the Global Academic Reputation Survey, which represents some interesting data about how institutions are thought of by fellow academics around the world. And I'll show you some information and some data about that shortly. Next slide, please. And this is just a top-level view on the World University Rankings methodology. We're looking at the teaching environment, which looks at things such as your teaching reputation, the income as well that you have per student. We're looking at the research environment, that's looking at research output, as well as reputation and income. We're looking at the citation impact, which is very much measuring the influence and impact of research itself. The international outlook pillar is incredibly important. Although it's only weighted 7.5%, it does have large knock-on effects to additional metrics within the rankings. Particularly international collaboration, we find, is quite an important one. Universities with a stronger international research collaboration generally have higher citation impact and also generally have stronger reputations. And we are also looking at money from industry. So how well do universities work in applying their research in a commercial and real world perspective? Next slide, please. We also make all of this data available to universities via THE data points. And I'd like to just show you some data points from this actual platform that I've pulled out. If you can please jump to the next slide, you will see a screenshot from the actual platform itself. And we have a number of Polish universities already working with us in this respect through data points. And you can see in this tool, you'll see that the university's performance is shown across the 13 metrics that we evaluate. And the distribution is represented by a box and whiskers plot. So this does give universities a very strong understanding of how they perform in the global context, in a regional context, as well as against certain peers. So you can see in this respect, there are there's some strong elements of Polish universities' performance here. The staff to student ratio is generally quite strong. So the teaching environment amongst Polish universities appears to be quite strong. But you can see, looking towards the right, the citation impact is quite generally, for these select universities anyway, is a little bit, is quite below the median. And also some of the international outlook metrics are also below the median. So it's great that the government-led initiatives in Poland are very much looking at boosting the international competitiveness of Polish universities, because this not only has huge benefits from a financial perspective, a diversity perspective, but it also has strong links to the actual rankings performances. Next slide, please. Looking at the reputation data, we distribute the Global Academic Reputation Survey once a year, and it's distributed completely by random to academics in the Scopus database. And we ask academics to vote for institutions who they believe perform great quality teaching and also great quality research. And what's quite interesting is when you look at the votes coming in for Polish universities, you can see that the vast majority of votes to Polish institutions are coming from academics within Poland. So naturally, the national level recognition for Polish institutions is very strong, as you'd expect. But then it quite quickly tapers off with the next portion of votes predominantly coming from the rest of Europe, followed by Russia and also the United States. But this does represent the fact that there is still some way to go when it comes to building international visibility around Polish universities' brands and research overall. Generally, when I look at this data for a university in Germany or the Netherlands or Australia, we see a much more even distribution of votes from many, many different countries around the world. But with Poland, it does seem at the moment that a lot of the votes are isolated from within Poland. So I think there's a huge opportunity for Polish institutions to build a stronger international outlook, build stronger international brands, which would support with reputation, collaborations, and also ultimately rankings performance. Next slide, please. If you look at the converse, looking at where Polish academics are voting in terms of where are the institutions located when a Polish academic is voting for a university, and you can see by far the US is at the top with the majority of the votes. That's not overall too surprising, given that the US is home to naturally the Ivy League and some very prominent super brands, and we do see that very consistently shown across all regions. But you can see after the US, a lot of Polish academics are voting for institutions in the UK, followed by the rest of Europe, and then within Poland itself as well. And if you go to the next slide, please, you will see that when it comes to a subject level, which subject areas are Polish universities best reflected according to the Global Academic Reputation Survey. And you can see there's quite a contrasting picture, with arts and humanities receiving a large portion of overall votes, and also physical sciences receiving a lot of votes. Following that, it's relatively even, with life sciences, business and economics, and clinical and health also being relatively prominent. But it does seem like Polish universities are best known for their arts and humanities subject areas, as well as physical sciences. I'd also want to stress that we do make this data available to universities. So if you'd like to access your institution's reputation, data set and performance, you can please email us at data@times-higher-education.com to request more information about that. If you go to the next slide, please. I also now wanted to touch just quickly on the impact rankings. I won't spend too much time on this, given that Duncan's done a fantastic presentation on this already. But THE is the only organization that looks at the how universities are working towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals on a global basis. And you can see that we are using the UN as the framework for this ranking methodology. Next slide, please. As Duncan has also demonstrated, with why universities are participating and why it matters. And you can see here a quote from the University of Sydney saying the impact rankings create a more level playing field, and that allows universities to demonstrate the positive impact that they're making beyond traditional rankings. And I think this is really fantastic. You know, as we saw in the results before, this ranking isn't necessarily biased towards the prestigious universities that have billion-dollar endowments and hundreds of years of heritage. We are seeing a lot of universities across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and other developing nations perform incredibly well in these rankings because they're not necessarily based on wealth, but more on the actual impact that these universities have on society. Next slide, please. And here are some, and we looked at earlier stakeholders that have a big stake to play when it comes to rankings, but an important one are naturally students. Students find rankings incredibly influential and useful when helping to inform their study destination. And here are some articles showing the growing importance that sustainability plays when it comes to the impact it has on student decision-making choice, especially amongst Generation Z. Generation Z are a lot more open to and put more emphasis and importance on how universities work towards sustainability. Next slide, please. And we actually have some interesting data as well. I'm sorry if I dropped out. We also collect some data from our Student Pulse panel. And the Student Pulse panel is a panel of thousands of students from around the world. And we put certain questions to them on different topical bases to get their opinion on what matters most to them. If you can please go to the next slide, you'll see some of the actual outcomes from the survey that we did of students. And you can see here that when we asked the question of how important it is to be a sustainable citizen, you can see that 80% of the students surveyed agreed that it is important for them to live their lives a way that is consistent with being a sustainable citizen. Furthermore, 75% of the Generation Z students who were surveyed said they had heard of the SDGs, which is an overwhelming proportion. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a slide that Duncan was referencing earlier to show which SDGs are of the highest priority amongst students. And quite consistently, you can see the number one option there was SDG number 4, quality education, with 37% of students surveyed saying that was an important SDG for them. And that actually quite closely aligns with a prominent SDG that universities were submitting data for as part of the rankings. But as you can see as well, climate action is incredibly important. Everything at the moment that we've been hit with in the news about global warming and the need to change the climate situation also is very important to Generation Z students. Interestingly enough, though, you can see that actual renewable energy is SDG number 7 isn't particularly high. I would have thought it might have been, given the links to climate action, but that might be the Generation Z students for you. If you go to the next slide, please, you also see how students perceive the role of universities businesses, governments, and society in tackling sustainable development. And 79% of students believe that universities have an important role to play in achieving the SDGs. Businesses, 77%, and you can see a large portion of students believe, 87% believe that governments have an important role in achieving the SDGs. So I think this is incredibly important to put sustainability at the forefront of your agenda, because it is certainly going to be influencing the next generation of students that will be coming through your doors. And my final slide, if you please jump to the next slide, you'll see the last question here is actions taken by students to assess a university's sustainability credentials. The number one selected option here was assess the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Now this one's quite important, because how do students go about assessing this? And that's generally your website is the first point of call, especially with Generation Z students. They likely won't be writing a letter to you. They won't be calling you and asking these questions. They will look at your website and they will see what your position is towards diversity and inclusion. And this is a big reason why we are asking universities to submit evidence, publicly available evidence of their work towards these different SDGs, is to make it publicly available, and so that society, different stakeholders, being students, governments, corporates, researchers, can actually learn from the institution and see what their position is towards these very, very important topics. And you can see that 56% of the students surveyed also looked at THE's impact rankings when assessing the university's credentials. And furthermore, just below that, you can see additional metrics such as if the university is environmentally friendly, if they exhibit ethical conduct, and so forth. So being vocal about the great work that you are doing is very, very important. It's important to be transparent and make all of these pieces visible. And universities that do participate in these impact rankings do very much benefit from huge global exposure, which can contribute to increased international student intake, increased funding, increased requests for partnerships, and other things. So we do very much encourage your participation. As Duncan mentioned, it is free to participate, albeit that there are some, obviously quite a lot of resources needed to submit to participate. But overall, universities that have participated have benefited greatly from doing so. So that's where I'd like to finish up. I'd like to thank you all again for joining. We do have this complete report on the student pulse, on the perspectives of students and how they perceived sustainable development. So I'd be very happy to share that report as well with anyone that is interested. But again, thank you very much. And now I believe we have some time for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you very much, Michael. And now, actually, very brief Q&A session. Maybe just a few questions. Do we have any questions? Could we put it on the screen? Okay. So, question number one, if I may just maybe if when question is, when a university submits more than 4 SIGs, which ones are taken into account in the ranking process? So Duncan, maybe if you could answer this question.
Absolutely. So firstly, of course, for every SDG that a university submits to, they will be in the ranking for that SDG. And if you go onto our website, you can, of course, look at each individual SDG. But for the overall ranking, we will choose the 3 SDGs plus SDG 17, the 3 SDGs that you score most highly in. And now that isn't always the same as the ones you rank most highly in, but it ensures that you have your best possible score is used to calculate your overall position.
Okay, thank you very much. Second question, please. Are some people from Poland in the advisory board that you mentioned here? What are the conditions or criteria to be a member?
So again, I'll take this one. So it's a good question. So at the moment, we don't have anyone from Poland on the advisory board. We are trying to balance it out across the world, so we don't want too many people from Europe or too many people from Asia, and that's one of the considerations. What I'm really looking for is people with a range of different experiences, coming from a range of different types of university as well, and people who are able to act, most importantly, as critical friends. So they believe in the concept of sustainability, they believe in the rankings, but they're not worried about, they're not frightened of challenging us when they think we've got it wrong, because that's really important to us. We will also be keeping in contact with the people of the 140 who we won't be able to take onto the board, and using them to as a feedback mechanism when we have more detailed proposals.
Thank you very much, Duncan. The next question, please. Just one, maybe. Why the impact dashboard is so expansive? It should be more available for theirs. I don't precisely understand the question, but maybe the tool is just perceived as a bit difficult. So Duncan?
Well, I'll deal with the first part of this, and then I'll hand over to Michael. So one of the things that's important to note is that there is an element of the tool which is always free to universities that participate in the rankings. The first page, which shows your scores, and if you remember from my slides, those little breakdown boxes by the metrics, you will always be able to see your own score in that tool for free. But of course, we also have a paid-for product. Michael, would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Duncan. I think we naturally try to, in addition to offering the free versions, we do try to make it as competitive as possible. We do have different options available as well. We do allow universities to subscribe only on an SDG basis. So if a university only submits data to 5 SDGs, we do offer access to the data at a much lower cost. But we do also have, obviously, open access to every single SDG for every university. So we hope that this platform can really help advance the universities, not only obviously rankings performance, but in general, the sustainability agenda. And there's a lot that can be learned from this platform to help support the university strategy. We do also offer regional pricing as well, where universities in Poland do also receive a lower price compared to some others around the world. So we are conscious of those, but we would certainly look forward to speaking with you further if you'd like further information about that.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you very much, Michael. Maybe I will try to give a few final remarks for our meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, here in Poland, we are growing in meaning of the international recognition. This is actually one of the main axis of the change since the last 15 years, the growing internationalization. But actually, dominant type of the evaluation is scientific evaluation, like research exercise in UK. And honestly, we are a bit tired of scientometrics. Dominant tool of the measurement based only on the publications and international indexes and impact factor and so on and so on. And it seems that this type of the expert assessment connected with the scientometric assessment, as in the impact ranking of Times Higher Education, is very useful for this perspective. In the Polish assessment system, in scientific evaluation, we have a criterion number 3, which is actually like the admission. We are putting the several evidences that the university has an impact. But there is no order in it. It's just very, very open. You can put any kind of an impact. You can put any type of the influence on your environment. And here, by these sustainable development goals, you are proposing a very, very precise agenda. What is the way to put the sustainable strategy into development of the university, and what way to assess the evidences of these activities? And I think it's a huge value. The crucial value is also possibility to benchmark and to make the comparison all over the world. I think it's a kind of the fundamental tool for assess our higher education institution and compare it with the international cohorts of the top universities, of the middle universities in this strategic group that we are operating. Very important thing is that Times Higher Education has this international recognition, because actually different thing is to see the local perspective, and more and more important from the perspective of the internationalization and globalization in our sector is to see, let's say, other circles, like how we are dealing in this region, in Central Eastern Europe, in comparison to the other countries, to our neighbors, let's say, how we are dealing in European Union in comparison to the different countries, how we are dealing globally with these newest growing tigers somewhere where they are investing the large money in the development of the higher education institutions. So definitely these are a very, very important tool and information. What we need here in Poland, we need to support, consulting support, support in marketing and the PR, for understanding that from one way, this is the reputation and values and the activities that are connected to that, but we must find a way how to expose the evidences, how the impact and the work that we are doing will be show to assessment, will be used for the building of the reputation and the image of the university as itself. So I think it was a very important meeting here. We would like to continue that. I would like to very much thank you guys. I would like to thank Michael and thank Duncan. Duncan, actually, it's the middle of the night because it's Canada, so it's a tough experience to make the long presentation in the middle of the night. Thank you very much, guys. I would like to thanks very much for participants of our panel, and for the audience. We have the very large interest in this seminar, and we can promise that we will continue with a more detailed discussion and with help in what way we can adjust, let's say, the consulting activities for the higher visibility of the Polish universities. This is our common goal. So thank you very much for the participation, and have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.